happened to me?
You're gonna get better.
Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about prosocial behavior and the sort of helping and kindness and empathy and these sorts of things. And I think this is an important lecture because we spend a lot of time in this course talking about all of the very nasty things that humans are capable of, and the various ways that those nasty things can either be encouraged or discouraged. So there's sort of a lot of pessimism present in this course, and it can feel like social psychology is the study of, human derangement, basically. But that's not true, of course, not entirely true anyways. We know that there's many examples of great acts of human kindness, and then also plenty of examples of small daily acts of helping or generosity or warmth. And, I think it's clear that humans have this undeniable capacity for prosocial behavior, for acting positively to one another, basically. But it does seem to depend somewhat on context. And there are, also plenty of examples of opportunities to help one another that are shirked, which is interesting in its own right. And so what I'd like to talk about is what the factors are that affect the likelihood of helping one another, and also some of the factors that might discourage helping each other, and sort of ground this conversation more broadly in the kind of nature of humanity, right? Like, what does the preeminence of prosocial behavior tell us about humans in general? So, by the end of today, hopefully you will have learned a little bit about the sort of nature of prosocial behavior, and you'll be able to describe it and sort of make an account as to whether it's based purely in self-interest or not. You should be able to explain the case for prosocial behavior made by evolutionary psychology and sort of make an argument as to whether or not that case seems strong. And you should have a general idea of how prosocial behavior emerges in development. You should be able to describe the role of empathy in prosocial behavior, and some of the other factors that also can encourage prosocial behavior. And kind of relatedly, hopefully you'll have an understanding of what the functions of prosocial behavior might be, and how those functions are a little bit sort of the same as the predictors of prosocial behavior. And then finally, you should be able to talk a little bit about what factors get in the way of prosocial behavior, and specifically you should have a pretty good understanding of the bystander effect and sort of some of the nuances of the bystander effect. And then sort of a broader idea about some of the other factors that might discourage prosocial behavior. Okay, so let's just go ahead and start with a broad definition of prosocial behavior. Basically, prosocial behavior is any action that's intended to benefit others. And this, varies widely from helping your friend with her chores to like running into a burning home to save some cats, which is a thing that a friend of mine did and was interviewed on the news about it. And we sort of bring it up to him all the time and, call him a hero. So it is a real thing that some normal people actually do and have done. And it can even include something as extreme as altruistic suicide, which is where you pay the ultimate price for the benefit of others. You kill yourself or allow yourself to die, sort of consciously, knowingly, decisively, in order to benefit others in some way. And I've seen a sort of a common conversation or kind of quote unquote debate play out when we talk about altruism and prosocial behavior. You know, I see this conversation emerge often among undergrads because I think it's very easy to sort of begin an analytical approach or like to attempt to be analytical about this sort of thing, but to kind of get in your own way about it a little bit. Because what happens is, like, a lot of people think to themselves, well, there's no such thing as prosocial behavior. There's no such thing as altruism, because we always benefit from it in some way. I would suggest that this is not as big an issue as it actually seems. You know, we know that there can always be self-serving elements towards, or like as a part of helping other people, even if the self-serving element is just that we feel good about ourselves. And of course, you know, there are other probably more concrete benefits to helping others. Like maybe we think that other people will like us more, or maybe we think it'll, you know, get us a significant other, like they'll be attracted to us or want to go on a date with us, or maybe even, you know, we think might like get us a job, which would be a pretty, or you know, a job or something like that, which would be a pretty major benefit. And I'm sure that is the case some of the time, right? And you could even make a case that altruistic suicide, the most extreme form of altruism, you know, still has a sort of self-interested benefit because it means you get to secure your own legacy. Like, you might think, well, I'll be known as a hero even after I'm dead. But I would suggest that in a lot of these cases, it doesn't actually make an action not prosocial, even if there is some potential self-interested benefit. And kind of an important aspect of this is that we can't ever actually really know what's in someone's heart, like what the true, you know, purest intention is there. And so in some ways it's kind of a pointless conversation anyways, right? Like in some ways it's just a sort of a wormhole we can go down forever, but it doesn't ever actually give us any great answers. There's this quote from actually one of my favorite books that's related to this, so I just wanted to bring it up since I have the opportunity. It's from a Toronto-based author, or he was before he died, named Robertson Davies, in his book The Manticore, and he says, "Now I want you to remember something, because I don't think we shall meet again very soon. It is this. However fashionable despair about the world and about people may be at present, and however powerful despair may become in the future, not everybody, or even most people, think and live fashionably. Virtue and honor will not be banished from the world, however many popular moralists and panicky journalists say so. Sacrifice will not cease to be because psychiatrists have popularized the idea that there is often some concealed, self-serving element in it. Theologians always knew that. Nor do I think love as a high condition of honor will be lost. It is a pattern in the spirit, and people long to make the pattern a reality in their own lives, whatever means they take to do so." And I think what's notable here is that it kind of illustrates that people have considered this issue, you know, long before psychologists, right? Like, we're not the first people to observe that perhaps helping others is at least partially motivated by the benefits that it can offer the self. But I think it's clear, you know, according to Robertson Davies here and to me, I suppose, that this isn't really a great model for the world. There's simply too many instances of people helping one another without any reasonable expectation of benefit, that the idea that helping is primarily based in self-interest or chiefly, you know, or like it's one of the main reasons that we help one another, it just doesn't really hold up to me. And, you know, this particular chapter in the textbook spends quite a long time debating this particular issue. I actually am kind of fine leaving it here. If you all would like to debate it amongst yourselves or to discuss the matter further, certainly I'm open to that, but I just don't even think it's that strong of a case in the first place that it's worth debating for any longer than the time that we've spent on it already. So I guess the one notable counterexample here, because this is kind of like an important sort of political example in the kind of modern world, is wealthy people creating their own charities or foundations or kind of donating in very specific ways to other charities or sort of mock charities or foundations or whatever. This doesn't really count as prosocial because in those cases, the primary desire is to benefit themselves, right? Like all they're doing is dodging taxes when they do that, especially if they create their own foundation or whatever. These are often make-work programs for rich kids who otherwise wouldn't be able to get a job, right? Or it's just a way to like pad out their resumes and dodge taxes. So in those cases, I mean, that's not prosocial. The primary desire is absolutely to benefit themselves. And in fact, if anything, it's an antisocial thing to do. It's a clear kind of like, it's a pretty sort of aggressive or hostile thing to do because they're stealing from the public coffers. They're dodging taxes, which is, anti-democratic and also is basically stealing from people who need that money more. So, that's sort of an important counterexample. There are other important counterexamples, but like I said, that's maybe enough on that topic for now. And it does actually seem like helping is often motivated chiefly by a desire to benefit someone else, even when it comes at great cost to the self. And so we call this sort of helping or this sort of prosocial behavior altruism. And so the textbook discusses sort of an extreme and a very interesting example of this, which is during the Holocaust in World War II, non-Jewish individuals who would risk their own lives in order to protect Jews and other people who were caught up in the Holocaust, were victims of the Holocaust, and often these people were strangers, and when interviewed, these people who helped, when they were asked what motivated them, they chiefly responded by saying that either their moral values, their sense of sort of right and wrong, their belief in what was good and what was bad, sort of drove them to help others, and also empathy, right? How would I feel if I was in that person's position? What must that person be going through? How horrible must that be? These help to drive us to help others, even when it's at great cost to ourselves or at great risk to ourselves. And so if we still help one another without any expectation of benefit, one possibility is that what's going on there is that it was selected for evolutionarily. In my opinion, I've sort of been critical of EvoPsych throughout this course, as you may or may not have noticed, but I do think here that like this is not a great or clear explanation. One sort of element of the evolutionary psych argument or case for prosocial behavior that seems to be supported is that we are actually more likely to help people who are related to us. This is true and perhaps trivially true, right? Of course, you're more willing to help your sister than you are some stranger. But like we also do help plenty of other people. Again, this is also trivially true. We know that we help strangers often in many cases, or people we barely know. And it is possible that this is because being helpful makes us more attractive to others and therefore potential mates. Like it makes us more likely to achieve biological fitness, which is the goal in sort of an evolutionary model. It might also make us more likely to fit in with a group and therefore to sort of secure our own safety and the safety of our young. Or it might make us more likely to receive help later on when we need it from others. None of these things are not true necessarily. It's just that as a whole, I don't know. I don't really find this to be a very satisfying kind of explanation or model. Maybe it explains in part the kind of emergence of and selection for helping behavior, but to me, it's not clear that all of this helps, or that all of this kind of maps closely onto actual biological fitness, which is, the sort of survival of your own genetic material in your offspring. I don't know. It doesn't track for me necessarily. One element of the evolutionary narrative that does seem to have some merit is the norm of reciprocity. And this is the expectation that, we help those who help us, and that people who we help will help us. And, you return a favor, basically. And this does actually seem to hold very true in human behavior in general. Like, humans need to return favors. It's kind of in our it seems to be hardwired in, even when it's to someone that we don't like. We still feel the need to return behaviors to return favors to one another. And I think, there are some people who are so self-interested that they're helping others only with the expectation that it'll benefit them down the line. I could use a clip from the television show The Office here, but that's a surefire way to get taken off YouTube, unfortunately. But there's an episode of The Office where the character Dwight keeps doing nice things for people, and then sort of saying, "You can owe me one," and then his plan is to get everyone to cash in he's going to cash in his favors with every single person at one time and use it to get someone fired. But one character, Andy, refuses to have kind of a favor hanging over his head, so he immediately finds something nice to do for Dwight, and they go back and forth kind of doing favors for one another to try to get the one up on the other, right? Like, this is a cartoonish illustration of the idea that you can be so self-interested that the only reason you ever help someone else is to get a benefit. But again, I don't really think that this is the whole story. I don't think it describes that much people or that much of the behavior, in my personal opinion. It's undoubtedly an element of it, though. So, I think, as I've made clear, in my opinion, it's sort of trivially true that humans sometimes do help one another with no expectation of reciprocity, of having it returned. And to that point, infants actually seem to do this naturally from a very early age. So this suggests that prosocial behavior, helping one another, is actually innate in humans. And there is some genetic explanation of the variance in helping behavior. Specifically, this has been shown by using twin studies. So identical twins show a somewhat stronger correlation in helping behavior than fraternal twins do, which indicates that genes do play a role in determining how prosocial we are. Just to really explain that concretely, identical twins have identical genetic configurations, whereas fraternal twins have just similar genetic configurations. But presumably, identical twins are treated about the same a lot of the time, and fraternal twins are treated about the same a lot of the time. And so any differences that you observe between the group of identical twins and the group of fraternal twins is probably mostly due to the genetic differences, right, to genes. And so because identical twins demonstrate a stronger correlation between the pair of twins in helping behavior than fraternal twins do, this means that genes do contribute at least somewhat to determining how prosocial we are. But it isn't only innate and genetic. We also do undoubtedly learn prosocial behavior. Our parents spend quite a lot of time imbuing us with the kind of behaviors and language of, kindness and politeness and these sorts of things. And our prosocial behaviors actually do vary based on our parental practices. In other words, parents who spend a lot of time and effort teaching us to be prosocial, their children will end up more prosocial than the children of parents who don't ever spend time teaching them that. So clearly it is also dependent in part on our kind of upbringing. And later on, other people will join in on this process. Teachers, friends, notably media will do this as well, kind of all throughout our lives, not just in our childhood. But, to illustrate, consider how much of children's media is designed to teach prosocial behaviors, right? Think about Sesame Street, right? Sesame Street teaches us the golden rule, teaches us to share, teaches us how to be respectful and kind of one another, and how to not sort of be cruel or exclusionary to one another. And it's not just true of Sesame Street or public children's television. It's true of a lot of our media. So folk tales, fables, myths, these things are often meant to illustrate good behavior. So a fun example of this to me is stone soup. I'm not sure how many of you know the story of stone soup, but it's an old folk tale. And basically the story is an old woman shows up in a village, and she says she's hungry and she's a traveler, and she's wondering if anyone will share their food with her, and everyone says no. And so she goes to the outskirts of town, and she boils a big pot that she had been carrying on her back, and she puts a stone in the pot of boiling water. And eventually one of the villagers come over and say, "What are you doing?" And she says, "Well, I'm making this pot of soup, and I have this magic stone. And if you cook a soup with this magic stone in it, it makes it delicious. It makes it, the most sort of wonderful, delicious soup you've ever had." And the villager says, "Oh, I'd like to try some of that delicious soup." And she says, "Well, you could, but the soup actually could do with some carrots. So if you'd be willing to donate some carrots from your garden, I'd be happy to share the soup with you." And so, of course, the villager brings back some carrots and donates it to the soup. And then, another villager notices the old woman and this first villager sitting around the pot, and comes over and asks what's happening, and sort of she repeats the same spiel and says, the same thing, but says it could really do with some meat, right? And so I'd be happy to share with you if you'd be willing to donate some meat to the soup, and so on, right? And another villager comes by, and she says the same thing about spices, salt and pepper, right? And so eventually a lot of villagers join in, and they've all sort of contributed a component to the soup. And finally she says it's done, and then she ladles a bowl up for all of the villagers, and sure enough, it's the most delicious soup they've ever tasted. And so they all kind of feast on this soup, and then once the lady is eaten and everyone's eaten and gone home, she gets up and puts the big pot on her back and takes the stone out of the pot and throws it on the ground and then walks away. Because of course the stone was never magic. The lesson is simply that if we share with one another, if we cooperate, if we're sort of generous, then we all will benefit, we'll all prosper, right? I know you all understand that lesson already. My point is that a lot of the folk tales that we've told one another for hundreds of years are meant to encourage this kind of prosocial behavior, are meant to teach us about the good way of behaving, basically. This seems to be one of the major functions of storytelling, because indeed we've been telling stories like that for thousands of years. Another kind of element of the development of prosocial behavior that we probably won't talk about a ton today is the kind of cultural contingency of prosocial behavior. In other words, this is the idea that the way that we can be helpful and kind and generous, or the way that we can be good and helpful to one another does seem to differ somewhat between cultures. And this isn't to say that some cultures are more helpful or more prosocial than others. That may or may not be true. That seems like a difficult question, but the idea here rather is that the definition of prosocial is likely different between different cultures. The things that we regard as being helpful in some places are not the same as other places. So, politeness, for example, or etiquette is very different between cultures. In some places, even saying things like "thank you" or "you're welcome" can be kind of misconstrued as a form of rudeness, which seems odd to us, Western Anglophones, right? But you can even see kind of like subtle differences within the sort of Western Anglo, or at least the Western sphere, right? Many Americans don't really say like sorry or excuse me when they're kind of like walking by others. This isn't regarded as being like rude in their sort of culture. But it does mean that if you go to the US and say things like "I'm sorry" all the time when you're trying to get around someone, you might get a weird look, because it's like, what are you sorry about? You haven't done anything wrong. You're just trying to get by me, right? Or, the sort of observance of lines, like of cues, in North America is pretty strict. But then throughout Europe, you sort of get very different adherences to the idea of lines or cues. And it's considered rude or not rude, depending on where you are, to kind of just ignore the line entirely. So, these aren't meant to be like big kind of swingy examples. They're just meant to be like small illustrations of the fact that what prosocial means is not static, and it's not the same for all humans. What is the same between all humans is the idea that we have some prosocial nature, that we do try to help one another. It's just that the exact manifestation of that helping behavior might differ depending on the culture in which it's embedded. An element of prosocial behavior, however, that does not seem to be culturally contingent is empathy. So when we see others suffering or in need of help, we might kind of automatically take the perspective of this person. What's their situation? Is it difficult? What are their options? And we might also feel their feelings, experiencing their pain or confusion or stress or sadness. And so when this happens, when we have this kind of empathic response, we become more likely to help that person. Understanding a person's like difficult position, feeling their negative feelings, this helps us to overcome our kind of natural self-interest, or, I don't want to say natural self-interest, I guess, but it helps us overcome our self-interest in order to be able to get to the point where we lend a hand. And indeed, it does seem like empathy actually correlates with helping behavior. Situations that encourage empathy increase the likelihood of us doing prosocial behavior, and also those who are higher in empathy as a trait tend to be more helpful people. And empathy also seems to be the means through which we can be taught to be more helpful. There's actually like substantial evidence that people who read more over time develop the kind of skills necessary for empathy. And that people who are more empathetic tend to act more prosocially. And so if we encourage people to experience empathy by asking them to specifically imagine the pain or sadness or difficulty that another person is experiencing, we're actually more likely to help them. So, I just mentioned the idea that like reading fiction, just reading stories, can help us to kind of develop those skills associated with empathy, which can then make us more likely to help other people. But there are kind of more concrete examples of this as well. So, for example, in one study, teachers who were evaluating an anti-bullying program that was going to be like implemented in their school, they were more likely to favor implementing that program after they were encouraged to like imagine the pain of rejection that like gets associated with bullying. So in other words, encouraging that empathetic response or that empathic response actually made them like support the idea of doing this anti-bullying program more. Similarly, students who, in a different study, students who listen to an addict describe his sort of challenges and the obstacles that he faced were more likely to donate to an addiction charity, after kind of listening to that account, because, they sort of took his perspective on, they took his emotional kind of response on. And empathy is also what enables us to help others, even when it comes at a cost to the self. Sort of empathy is in some ways it's what pays that toll when helping actually costs something for us. So the textbook describes, I think, a very interesting study that demonstrates this principle. And so in this study, you show up and there's another, quote, participant there, and you're both going to complete the study together. Now, of course, the other participant, Alicia, is a Confederate. Alicia is not actually a participant in the study, but you think she is. And so you and Alicia complete a kind of initial preference survey, and that you either learn that you and Alicia are very similar, you have the same sort of tastes and preferences, or you learn that you're very different, one or the other, right? And then the other participant, again, not a Confederate, not actually a participant, they're acting, she's randomly, quote unquote, randomly assigned to complete a performance task under stressful circumstances. And then you're assigned to observe and form an impression of her, either during the entire study, like for the whole thing, or just for the first few trials. And what ends up happening is Alicia, the other participant, receives repeated mild electric shocks. And after the first round of shocks, she's sort of freaking out. She's obviously anxious. She explains that she's like having a really bad time, and she's actually kind of has a fear of being shocked. And then the experimenter isn't really sure what to do, but thinks it over and then suggests that, well, you could switch places with her. Maybe that would fix things. Maybe that would help. And so what happens is the researchers think that by making you feel like you're similar to Alicia, that will encourage a high empathy response. And by making you think that you're not similar to Alicia, that will encourage a low empathy response. So that's where this high empathy, low empathy comes from. And I'm just going to get my laser pointer here. What happens is that when people didn't feel similar to Alicia, they were therefore thought to be less likely to feel empathy for her. 64% volunteered to trade places with her if they would have to like spend the rest of the time watching her get shocks. Like if they had to stick around for the rest of the study, they really didn't want to have to endure watching her get shocks over and over again. But if they didn't have to watch her take any more shocks, in other words, if it was easy for them to simply like leave the study, then only 18% offered to switch with her, offered to sort of stay to help. So basically, as long as they didn't have to watch her get shocked anymore, they were less likely to help her. However, when participants do feel similar to her, and therefore they're more likely to experience empathy, 80 to 90% of the participants stayed and took her place, regardless of whether like it was easy for them to escape or not, regardless of whether they could leave otherwise or if they had to stick around to watch her get shocked. And so the researchers interpret this as being evidence that empathy effectively makes us behave prosocially. In this sort of high empathy condition, almost everyone does the kind of prosocial thing, even at cost to themselves, because they know they're going to have to experience the mild electrical shocks instead of Alicia. Now, I will make one sort of complicating note here that I think deserves to be stated, even though it makes things a little bit more muddy, which is that I'm not sure exactly what they're manipulating here in this study. They claim to be manipulating empathy, and they might have measured empathy in some way and can prove that that's what they're actually manipulating. But I would suggest that what they're actually manipulating might be in-group bias, or maybe they're manipulating both, but certainly in-group bias appears to be the thing that they're manipulating. In other words, what is different between the low empathy condition and the high empathy condition is how similar do you think you are to Alicia? In other words, is she a member of your in-group? And as we've discussed extensively throughout this course, we tend to be a lot more kind of generous towards people that we regard as being part of our in-group. This is our in-group bias, right? And so it's not totally clear to me whether they're measuring in-group, manipulating in-group bias, or whether they're manipulating empathy. I'll sort of take their word on it. But I think it's at least worth being like moderately skeptical here, given that we already have ample evidence that we're much more motivated to help others who are like us, who are part of our in-group. For example, we're more likely to help people who are part of the same ethnic group as us, right? So, a little bit sort of murky, but that's fine. I just wanted to kind of introduce that little bit of nuance before we move on. So, empathy, I think, it's clear that empathy is a crucial element in understanding and encouraging prosocial behavior. And one kind of strange thing that I need to point out, or at least I feel like I need to point out, which is the strange thing, is that empathy is not a bad thing. This seems to be a bit of a trend in kind of like online psychobabble, sort of unscientific, self-helpy kind of advice that people just kind of spout online. I've sort of seen this thing pop up on like Instagram infographics or like viral tweets or whatever. The suggestion that empathy is in some way a drain on us, or it makes us unwell because we're so inundated with the emotional content of other people. To my knowledge, there is not a lot of evidence to back this up. Empathy is actually generally considered to be a very good thing, for reasons that we'll talk a little bit more about later. But like, broadly speaking, it tends to make us happier people. It tends to encourage better bonds with other people, which also makes us happier. And in fact, our emotional connections to others, our social security net, our sense of social support, these are like some of the primary determinants of well-being and happiness, and empathy feeds into all those things. So, the idea that empathy is somehow a bad thing, or it's going to make you sick or unwell, or you're too empathic, you're too empathetic, this is largely, to my knowledge anyways, it's largely kind of psychobabble, sort of pseudo-profound bullshit, to use one of the industry terms. So, I'd be a little bit skeptical of that. Like I've said before in the course, just because someone says something on the internet doesn't necessarily make it true, and often people say things with a level of confidence that makes it seem like they couldn't possibly be wrong. But if you see it in an Instagram infographic, I'd say there's a pretty high chance that it might be wrong. So, stay frosty out there. But if you've never encountered that notion before, that empathy is a bad thing, then don't worry about it. But I, strangely enough, do feel the need to make that point, because I see this bizarre claim online. very often. And coincidentally, I saw it just today, even though my lecture was already written and I had already planned to talk about this point. I just coincidentally encountered it again today. So it's out there. Anyways, moving on from that tangent. Let's talk about some other emotional responses that might also encourage prosocial behavior and helping, such as guilt. So guilt is a feeling of personal responsibility that we have for the negative experiences of others. And when we feel this, even if we're not actually responsible, we're more likely to help out. And it turns out, even helping other people, not the person who was harmed, just like helping some unrelated person, even that can kind of help us alleviate that sense of guilt. And so inducing a state of guilt in general seems to make us more likely to help others, which is, I think, so interesting. And we can also feel what's called collective guilt, which is a state in which, we're clearly not responsible for some particular harm, and yet we do feel guilt for that harm. And so the sort of primary example of this is socially advantaged groups. So, white people, rich people, these sorts of things. They sometimes feel kind of a collective guilt for some socially disadvantaged groups. So, non-white people, or perhaps, specifically black people, or, poor people in general, right? Sort of white guilt or wealth guilt. And people who experience this collective guilt, are actually more likely to support policies that can help those groups, those disadvantaged groups. And so that is a good thing, largely speaking, if you sort of believe in egalitarian values. It is good that people who are unduly advantaged might feel some amount of discomfort with the fact that they've received those advantages, and so would kind of support policies that even the playing field in some way. However, it is worth noting that guilt is not the best motivator for prosocial behavior. Generally speaking, what guilt does is motivate us to reduce the guilt. In other words, to get rid of that bad feeling, rather than motivate us to genuinely help someone else or genuinely do something useful. And sometimes these things overlap. Sometimes we can do something that both reduces the negative feeling and actually does help someone else, but not always. What it can do is lead to very kind of symbolic or tokenistic forms of helping that might not actually do anything other than make us feel better, other than reduce that sense of guilt. And so the kind of preeminent example of it these days, or for the past, sort of 10 years, is what some have called slacktivism. This is the idea of signing petitions online, or liking or sharing information online, or using hashtags, or changing your avatar to something. Basically, none of these things do anything other than satisfy our goal to help and sort of reduce that sense of guilt. It makes us feel better, basically. But it also, there's some evidence to show that it reduces the likelihood that you'll ever go and do anything helpful, that you'll ever do something actually meaningful. And so you do something very low effort. It satisfies the goal, so it removes the goal from our sort of mind, from our kind of active motivation domain, and it makes us feel better, and then we don't have to do anything anymore because we already helped. But it turns out the kind of practical outcome or practical utility of just liking an article, or sharing an Instagram infographic, or signing a petition or whatever. The practical outcome of these things is basically nil a lot of the time. And so, I think it's worth being a little bit skeptical or weary of these forms of quote-unquote prosocial behavior, because what they do seem to do is make us feel better and make us feel good about ourselves, but it's not clear that they actually effectively kind of satisfy the actual point of prosocial behavior, which is presumably to benefit others, to help other people. Another kind of important component of encouraging prosocial behavior is the feeling of like participation and belonging to a group. And when we feel more closely tied to another person or to a unit of some sort, so like, a parent or a significant other, we're more likely to help that person or that unit or that group, whatever. And this communality, this sense of communality, means that we can kind of attend to that other person without even really regarding it as doing something for someone else, because that person is kind of close to being you anyways. If you're getting coffee with a close friend and you buy their coffee for them, you probably don't even really ever process that as being like a major cost to you, or sort of thinking of yourself as like, oh, well, I've done this very nice thing for someone else, because that person is so close to you that in some ways you're kind of just helping yourself in a way, if that makes sense. These are the people who we also kind of feel the worst about turning our back on, right? The worst about sort of not helping. But in some ways, I think these are the easiest people to help, and also the most important people to help, because they're the ones that we have these kind of close bonds with that are dependent in part on prosocial behavior. But it comes, I think, very naturally to most of us to kind of just help these people without even really thinking about it, because it almost feels like we're doing something good for ourselves anyways. Gratitude can also encourage us to help again in the future. So in other words, if we do something nice for someone else and they express genuine gratitude and thankfulness, then we're more likely to kind of do something, to help them again in the future. And this is partly because gratitude makes us feel good, right? This sort of thing that we've talked about earlier about the self-interest of like, oh, we feel good when we do something for someone else, and that gratitude is part of that. Makes us feel good. But I think a kind of deeper element of gratitude here is that it seems to encourage that feeling of communality. When we do something nice for someone else and they express gratitude, we feel a certain closeness to that person. We feel ourselves, the ties that bind us are a little bit tighter then, right? And this is another key to helping behavior, as we just discussed. This communality is key for encouraging prosocial behavior. And gratitude actually has benefits for both the giver and the receiver, because it turns out that showing gratitude is associated with a variety of positive benefits, like to our sense of well-being. People who express gratitude tend to be kind of just happier people, and kind of nicely or neatly, people who express gratitude also seem to be more helpful. So that kind of wraps it all up in a nice little bow, I think. And to me, what this all seems to indicate is that prosocial behavior, gratitude, these all kind of help us to belong to a group or to units. They help us to form strong bonds, to kind of solidify our collective social security. And then this, helps to ensure our kind of mutual aid, our protection, our kind of, our collective benefit, right? This helps us to become closer to other people, which in turn makes us more prosocial, which in turn, brings us closer to other people, and so on, right? It's a sort of like virtuous cycle that helps us to act more compassionately and to ensure collective prospering for the group. And sort of it ensures that for everyone, right? And in contrast, if you remain self-interested and egoistic, that seems like it's going to weaken your likelihood of forming strong bonds. And that makes it less likely that you'll help others and that others will help you, which seems like it will weaken, right, this sort of vicious cycle instead of the virtuous cycle. And so in this way, it sort of seems like prosocial behavior fits in really nicely with these other, like functions, predictors and purposes to kind of like bring it all together. And I think that tells a nice little story of like, to me, that's the closest it gets to explaining prosocial behavior using kind of self-interested language or evolutionary language or, biological fitness language. But still, I don't really regard it as being, about biological fitness or self-interest. I regard it as about being, forming close bonds, which is not purely self-interested, right? It's about encouraging collective prospering, and that does benefit the self, but it benefits more people than there are more others benefiting than just the self, right? So I don't think we have to think of it in terms of self-interest. So now that we've covered the nature of prosocial behavior and the sort of factors that encourage it, I think the obvious next question presents itself, which is, what about when we don't help? We have all these predispositions towards helping, and yet we seem to fail pretty spectacularly on a regular basis to help one another. At least sometimes, right? We've all done this. Like, it's not just some people. We have all sometimes failed to help people who are close to us or strangers, and sometimes we even feel quite badly about it. And on a broader level, as a society, it's actually kind of clear that disregard for people who are struggling is like normalized. This is sort of accepted almost, or even enforced. Consider the persistence of homelessness, right? We live in one of the richest countries in the world in the history of civilization. Homelessness could easily be abolished. It has been abolished by poorer countries than ours, like Cuba, for example. Homelessness can be abolished with relatively little sort of movement, but we continue to abide it. And I think that's interesting, right? What does that tell us? Why do we sometimes fail to help one another so profoundly, both as individuals and groups? It's a complicated question with complicated answers. And, even just looking at that difference between, countries that have effectively abolished homelessness and Canada, where we regard ourselves as being very nice people, very generous people, and yet we tolerate a relatively high rate of homelessness, especially here in Toronto. The answer to why that is complicated, and it can't be answered by a single lecture or even just by psychology. But I do think it's at least worth kind of probing these sorts of questions. And in some cases there are tragedies that it's rather simple to look at. Like, it's rather simple to see how clearly they could have been prevented if someone had just helped out. Not so with a problem as complicated as homelessness, but there's this famous case in psychology that we often talk about, and it's the case of Kitty Genovese. And in 1964, in New York City, she was attacked early in the morning on the way home from work. Basically, outside of her apartment building, someone assaulted her and stabbed her for 30 minutes. And apparently it was quite brutal, right? And so for 30 minutes, she's crying for help, screaming that she's been attacked. And apparently, over 38 people witnessed this attack from nearby apartment windows. But not a single one of them called the police until after the attack had ended. And so she died on the way to the hospital, possibly because, no one had intervened and no one even called the cops for such a long time. And what this, the reason that we talk about this example so often in psychology is because it illustrates what we call the bystander effect, which is the idea that we're less likely to help people when others are present who might also help. And this effect has been shown across numerous studies. And what we actually find is that the effect becomes stronger with the more people who are included, the more people who are present. So what explains this effect? One of the explanations is what's called pluralistic ignorance. And this is the idea that we rely on others to determine for us whether something bad is happening. we don't want to be the one to kind of like make the jump to seeing something as an emergency. And so we instead rely on others to make this decision for us, or sort of to rely on the collective to make the decision. We're kind of all glancing around at each other like, okay, who's going to do this? Like, who's going to flip the switch and turn this into like a serious situation? We're all kind of worried, I guess, about the idea of doing that. It maybe brings a lot of pressure, or it brings a lot of attention to us, and it has the potential for embarrassing us in some way if we're wrong. But if everyone does this, then no one's ever going to make the decision to declare the situation worthy of intervention. And so it has this kind of huge risk associated with it, where it might prevent anyone from ever kind of acknowledging like, hey, this is bad, something bad is happening here. And there's a related effect that we've actually talked about in the course already, which is diffusion of responsibility. And this is basically when responsibility is evenly distributed among bystanders. And so I'm just going to sort of illustrate this using a graph. And so what this graph shows here is this is the amount of responsibility. And so each person is experiencing some amount of responsibility, and then this sort of totality of responsibility is diffused among all the people evenly. Everyone's experiencing some sort of small amount of responsibility. And what this red line is meant to represent is this sort of threshold for doing something. In other words, unless they experience a kind of an amount of responsibility above this red line, and they clear that threshold, then they won't do anything. They won't help, basically. And so you can imagine if there were fewer people, then sort of each person would bump up some, right? Because there's fewer people, so the same amount of diffusion the same amount of responsibility is being distributed amongst fewer people, and so each person has a higher amount of responsibility themselves. And what you see basically is that if the responsibility remains distributed in this way, then no one will ever kind of clear the threshold enough in order to help. We're all sort of thinking, well, someone else will do it. And statistically speaking, that's sort of true, since there is more responsibility concentrated in everyone that isn't us than there is in us, right? But ultimately, this sort of not a very useful situation, because no one will ever help in a situation like this. And so one solution is to just identify a single person who can help and specifically ask that person for it. Like if you're in need of help, you can sort of just pick a person and sort of demand that they help you. Because what it does is it concentrates all of the responsibility in a single person. And then this happens. So everyone else's responsibility decreases, but the person that you identify, their responsibility goes through the roof, and it clears that threshold. And now they sort of feel a sense of responsibility enough to make them actually do something and help. So we talked about this phenomenon a little bit earlier on in the course, because I was requesting that students in the class share their notes publicly with the other students in the class, so that students who needed notes kind of shared with them for whatever reason would have access to them. And the problem with asking a favor like this of your class is that, say there's 200 students in the class, I have now put this responsibility out there and then divided it amongst 200 people. And so, it looks like this, except distributed amongst 200. Almost no one is going to clear that threshold, right? But I can't do this either. I can't really email a single student and just pick someone and sort of demand that they share their notes, because that's not a requirement of the class, and it might be unfair of me to expect that from a given student. They might feel too much pressure from me. They might not feel like they can refuse me because I'm the professor or whatever. But we saw that kind of play out, and so I had to try to remind you all of this phenomenon. For what it's worth, I was not sort of running a study on you all. I genuinely was hoping that you would all share your notes publicly, but it was a useful sort of opportunity to illustrate this effect and remind you all that, responsibility naturally gets distributed like this, And so if you're conscious of that fact, if you're aware that your responsibilities are being distributed like this, maybe being conscious of it will kind of help you all bump it up above threshold, and then you'll be more likely to help. Hopefully that illustrates this idea of diffusion of responsibility, because I do think it's important. I think the bystander effect is important in general, but in particular, I think this kind of almost mathematical modeling sort of the way that we can kind of not help people is, it's quite interesting and illustrative. And it also helps to explain these really horrendous situations where clearly someone should have helped and yet no one did. And it's not because everyone who was there are just bad people. It's more like everyone assumed that other people there were good people. And so none of them felt like, oh, well, I'll be the one to step up. But yeah, hopefully that sort of illustrates that phenomenon well. Another reason that we sometimes fail to help other people is because we find it difficult to process the suffering of like large groups of people. So there's this quote that it's sort of said in lots of different ways, and it's something like, the death of one man, this is a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, that's a statistic. This is commonly misattributed to Joseph Stalin. I'm not sure why he didn't say it. It's actually, I think, a German writer named Kurt Tucholsky. But when we are trying to process the kind of suffering of a very large group of people, this makes us less likely to help out. We're actually much more likely to help out when we focus on the experience of a single individual rather than a large group. And this might be because the kind of large-scale suffering is beyond our comprehension. It can be kind of so overwhelming that we like disarm preemptively in order to, experience the distress that it would bring, right? And it serves a purpose. It helps us avoid kind of feeling constantly paralyzed by the immense amount of suffering in the world, right? But it also lets us off the hook. It kind of helps us avoid feeling bad, or it helps us avoid having to help like the homeless or the poor or the disabused of our society, right? The people who are clearly struggling, often through no fault of their own. We sort of don't have to help them because it's just this large kind of faceless mass. And relatedly, people can also kind of avoid the emotions that would encourage them to help. We might like kind of consciously stifle that empathy response that like otherwise would force us to act. And it's because that empathy response, or the action itself, might make our lives more difficult. So for example, this is a bit of a little bit of an old-fashioned example, depending on whether or not you all watch TV and see commercials. But if you see like a commercial coming on TV from an organization that helps like abused animals, and so it plays the sort of sad slow motion black and white footage of sad-looking puppies and kittens, and it plays a sad song, you might instinctively change the channel so that you don't have to experience the kind of emotional reaction and the empathetic response that it would generate. You can just sort of sidestep it entirely so that you don't feel like, oh, I need to help these puppies and kittens. And more importantly, this sort of phenomenon has been demonstrated in research. So in one study, participants chose between either listening to an account from a homeless man that would encourage their empathy, or an account that would be more like expository. In other words, like it just describes like events, or like describes like precisely, concretely things that happened, rather than sort of in a more emotional, persuasive account. And participants knew that after they heard this account, whichever account it was, they'd have to make a decision about whether to volunteer their time or not. But the catch is that some participants would be deciding whether to volunteer like an hour of time writing fundraising letters for that man, which is a relatively small investment of time. And then other participants had to decide whether to volunteer several hours providing emotional and social support to that man, which is obviously a much larger investment of time. And so what happens is when they knew that they would face a decision about whether to commit a large amount of time helping the homeless man, about 2/3 of people end up wanting to hear the kind of expository account, like the less kind of emotional, less persuasive one, because they knew that this would elicit less empathy and less sadness. So you see this here, like 2/3 of people want, because they know it's going to affect their decision about a large investment, they want the one that's kind of like easier to handle, so that they won't feel as bad rejecting it, perhaps. But what happens is when they knew that the request for help would be a lot smaller, only 1/3 ask for that kind of expository sort of concrete story. And 2/3 were willing to kind of have the more heartbreaking emotional story that with the more sort of persuasive emotional appeal, the one that's going to encourage the empathic response. And what this tells us is that there are conditions under which we just outright avoid empathy. We try to avoid it and the related emotions that come along with empathy. And this is so that we don't have to kind of swallow the costs of helping or to suffer the guilt of refusing to help. And in this way, we can kind of be our own worst enemy when it comes to prosocial behavior. We can sometimes find it easier to ignore the needs of others when the costs seem too great or too overwhelming. And I think this helps to explain why there are so many needs that can go unmet with kind of relatively little outcry from the public. If you look at the public health crisis in the US, the kind of constant public health crisis that they undergo by way of having a private healthcare system, and people can't afford to have babies or to have diabetes or whatever. And I mentioned the U.S. and their and also I guess their opioid crisis that to some extent exists in Canada as well. But Canada have our own clear problems. We have suicide crises and lack of clean water in some indigenous communities. This seems to go with relatively little public outcry, with relatively little help from most people, even though many, many people are aware of it. Homelessness, like I said, could be abolished relatively easily. Poorer countries than us have abolished homelessness, and yet we continue to abide it in our society. Same thing with poverty, right? And homelessness, poverty, these are sort of tied up in other crises of kind of public health, like mental illness and substance abuse, right? There is a very high number of schizophrenics, for example, in the homeless population in Toronto. All of these things are, I think, easier to ignore in some ways, right? It's easier to avoid having the empathy response and having the emotions that come along with that, because if we were really committed to helping, or if we were sort of felt that need to help, that is very costly. It's very challenging. It's very overwhelming. In some ways, it's too intimidating to even begin to do. And so we can simply avoid it altogether. And, this only gets grander the more grand the issue is, right? Consider poverty and famine in the global south. Forget our localized problems. What about the kind of global struggles that we're facing, that other fellow humans are facing? It becomes very difficult, I think, to know how to even begin to help, or to how to manage the emotions and the empathy that comes along with considering these crises. And so instead, sometimes it's easier to just, avoid it. And on that dour note, let's wrap up. So today we discuss the kind of nature of prosocial behavior and its kind of innate presence in human behavior that I believe cannot be explained purely by self-interest. We described some of the ways in which prosocial behavior emerges. And we also identified the roles of empathy, guilt, communality in encouraging prosocial behavior. And then finally, we discussed some of the factors that discourage prosocial behavior. So that's all for this week. Hopefully you learned a little bit about this this kind of large topic of prosocial behavior, generosity, helping one another. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's important that we talk about this at least a little bit, because so many of the other lectures in this course are really coded kind of negatively and pessimistically. And it's not because I am necessarily a pessimist about human nature per se. It's more just because in some ways it's the spicier topic, right? It's the things that are studied a little bit more, they feel a little bit more dire or a little bit more important or a little bit more interesting, but that's not always true. And understanding, I think, the ways in which humans have been able to ensure our kind of mutual benefit, our mutual prospering, our mutual survival, is in itself both interesting and important. So hopefully that kind of introduction to prosocial behavior was interesting for you all. So let's finish up with a few media recommendations related to prosocial behavior. So the first recommendation is a novel by one of my favorite authors, Aldous Huxley. This is a novel called Island. So many of you are probably familiar with his first novel. I think it's his first novel, Brave New World. Brave New World is sort of a discussion of dystopia, an exploration of dystopia as a function primarily of political means. How can dystopia be sort of achieved and established politically? Island is, if I'm not mistaken, his final novel, and this presents a sort of counter thesis or a sort of counterpoint, which is an exploration of utopia as a function of spirituality, rather than the sort of dystopia as a function of political means. I think it's a really enjoyable book, and it's sort of a heartwarming isn't the right word, but it does present, I think, a very positive understanding of human nature, specifically from the perspective of someone who is not from that kind of utopian society. And I think it's worth a read, and I think in some ways Brave New World gets overemphasized as Huxley's contribution to the literary world, whereas Island probably warrants a much bigger part in that discussion. My next recommendation is a series of 5 novels, I believe, by Ursula K. Le Guin, called The Books of Earthsea, or the Earthsea Cycle. There's, like I said, 5 books, and you sort of read them in order. And the first book is called A Wizard of Earthsea, and the second book is called The Tombs of Atuin. And in my opinion, these are the best 2 books. So you could sort of just read those first 2 and then see if you were on board, and you could check out then if you wanted. They're short books too, so they don't take too long. But basically, these are fantasy novels that I think are a lot less. They're excellent world-building novels. Like, they present a very compelling novel, kind of alien landscape of Earthsea. But they have a lot to say about humanity and how humans behave, and how that behavior is culturally contingent and temporally contingent, how it can change over time, but also how humans are, I think, capable of a wide variety of acts that range from great evil to great good, and span the sort of daily quotidian range in between of kind of small positives or small negatives, little kind of almost boring bits of goodness or boring bits of evil. I've recommended her novels before, I believe, in this section, but different novels. She is just one of the great writers, I think, of our time. So I think these books are very much worth checking out. And then my final recommendation is kind of an odd one, which is a comedy sort of reality show called Nathan For You. Nathan For You is a kind of fake reality TV show. I mean, it is real in that they do cover real people, but it's a show where this gentleman here, Nathan Fielder, claims to help businesses with their business, like to sort of encourage their profit in some way, but his ideas are always like absurd and foolish and sometimes like grotesque and often quite stupid. But the show is hilarious. But what happens as you watch more and more of it, and as you see the kind of strange characters that he encounters and these sort of like bizarre, very real but very absurd people that he invites into his life in this show, I think it presents actually a very kind of like warm view of humanity. Because despite this guy, Nathan Fielder, kind of acting like a jackass a lot of the time, people are very kind to him, and they're kind of very warm and are filled with gratitude often for his very bad ideas. And I don't know, it's a very difficult show to watch because it's sort of cringy, but I think it's a very enjoyable show to watch. And ultimately, there's a lot more like heart in it than there is malice. Like I don't ever really get the sense that this show is, interested in like humiliation, or if it is interested in humiliation, it's only interested in humiliation of this guy Nathan Fielder who makes the show, not of the kind of nice but strange people that he encounters on the show. So it's worth checking out. Okay, thanks for your attention this week, and I'll see you all next time.